August 6, 1945. A warm, quiet evening in the English countryside. The war in Europe was over, and the world was catching its breath. But inside a large, ivy-covered manor called Farm Hall, something extraordinary was happening. Something that would rewrite how Germany's top minds saw themselves, their country, and the war they had already lost. To the outside world, Farm Hall looked like a peaceful estate. To those who lived inside, it was a cage wrapped in comfort. 10 of Nazi Germany's most brilliant scientists, the men who once worked on Hitler's atomic ambitions, were now prisoners of the British. They had beds, gardens, even a piano. But they also had something else they didn't know about. Every room, every hallway, every whisper was bugged. Hidden microphones were everywhere. British intelligence was listening to everything. That evening, as the men sat down to dinner, a British officer entered holding a newspaper. He said very little, only that something remarkable had happened in Japan. The Americans had dropped a single bomb on a city called Hiroshima. One weapon, one explosion, one city, gone. At first, the room erupted in laughter. It had to be propaganda, an Allied trick, impossible. But the officer didn't flinch. He calmly read from the paper, the flash brighter than the sun, the city vaporized, the radiation poisoning survivors miles away. Silence fell. Then one man, tall, bespectacled, calm but visibly shaken, stood up. Werner Heisenberg, Germany's leading physicist, the mind behind Hitler's nuclear research. Without saying a word, Heisenberg reached for a notepad and began scribbling equations. His pencil scratched furiously against the paper as the others watched. Minutes passed, then suddenly he stopped. He looked up and whispered, "It's real." They actually did it. The room exploded, shock, disbelief, anger, even awe. The British microphones caught it all. Otto Hahn, the man who had discovered nuclear fission years earlier, sat in stunned silence. "My God," he muttered, "I started this." Another scientist, Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker, shook his head in disbelief. How? How could they have done it before us? For months, British intelligence had recorded their idle conversations, trivial chatter, complaints about the food, talk of their families. But tonight was different. Tonight, the microphones captured the sound of realization. The moment Germany's greatest scientists understood that their defeat ran far deeper than the battlefield. They hadn't just lost the war. They had lost the future. As the night deepened, the atmosphere inside Farm Hall changed. The once proud men of science, who had believed themselves the most advanced minds in Europe, now sat humbled, circling one question. How did America beat us to the bomb? Otto Hahn looked sick. "I discovered fission," he said bitterly, "and now it has killed 100,000 people." He walked away, refusing to speak further. Some feared he might harm himself. The others began to argue. Von Weizsäcker was furious. "The Nazi government never gave us what we needed," he shouted. "They starved us of funding, of freedom." Another scientist, Kurt Diebner, snapped back, "No, we had money, we had resources. We just made the wrong choices." Heisenberg tried to defend himself, insisting, "We were working on reactors, on energy, not weapons. That was never our goal." But even he seemed unconvinced by his own words. The British transcripts later revealed something remarkable, a mix of guilt, confusion, and quiet relief. Some scientists were secretly glad they hadn't created such a weapon for Hitler. Others were mortified that their rivals across the ocean had succeeded. Paul Hartek, one of the chemists, said it flatly. "We were simply behind. The Americans were better. We have to accept it." Those words hit the room like shrapnel. But then, as the initial shock faded, curiosity took over. Heisenberg picked up his pencil again. He couldn't let it go. He began calculating, estimating how much uranium would be needed, what type of design the Americans must have used, and what kind of industrial effort could make it possible. He wrote for hours. Equations filled page after page. By morning, he had the answer. It was uranium-235, he said. That's the only way they could do it. He explained the details to the group, the enrichment process, the staggering amount of energy required, the industrial scale of separation. Thousands of workers, enormous facilities, he said. They must have used gaseous diffusion, factories the size of towns. The others fell silent. They had nothing comparable. Germany's nuclear project had been scattered, underfunded, understaffed, and sabotaged by bureaucracy. The Americans had built an entire empire to forge a single weapon. One scientist muttered quietly, "We were working in basements, and they were building cities." That line summed up everything. It wasn't just a technological defeat, it was a moral and industrial one. They realized something they'd never admitted before. Germany's downfall wasn't just on the battlefield. It was in the labs, the factories, and the decisions made years earlier. The more they talked, the clearer it became. The Americans had not only outbuilt them, but outthought them. And that truth cut deeper than any bomb. Late that night, the generals, also imprisoned at Farm Hall, joined the conversation. General Erich von Stein listened quietly before speaking in a low, measured voice. "Gentlemen," he said, "you are missing the real meaning of this bomb." All eyes turned toward him. "This weapon doesn't just end the war with Japan," he continued, "it ends war itself. Whoever holds it controls the world." No one spoke. They hadn't thought of that. For years they had obsessed over equations, theories, and experiments. But von Stein saw the truth in a single moment. "This isn't a scientific victory," he said. "It's the creation of fear. And America now commands it." The room went completely silent. In that instant, the scientists realized that their failure wasn't simply missing a scientific breakthrough. It was failing to understand the world they lived in. Power had shifted, forever. The microphones at Farm Hall captured it all: disbelief, guilt, resignation, and awe. And as dawn broke over the English countryside, the most brilliant men of Hitler's Germany finally understood. They hadn't just lost a war, they had lost an era. Morning light filtered through the barred windows of Farm Hall. Heisenberg hadn't slept. His desk was covered in notes, pages of equations, hastily drawn diagrams, and calculations running off the edges. To the others, he looked possessed. By dawn, he called the group together. "I know how they did it," he said quietly. His tone was heavy, like a man delivering bad news. He pointed to his notes. It had to be uranium-235, a gun-type design. They used conventional explosives to drive two subcritical masses together. Simple, elegant, and deadly. Heisenberg paused, letting it sink in. They didn't just use science. They used scale. He walked the others through the process: isotope separation, enrichment, the staggering power needed to produce enough uranium for one bomb. To extract a single kilogram of uranium-235, you needed hundreds of tons of raw uranium, enormous machinery, and endless electricity. Germany had tried it, but their facilities were small and scattered. Heisenberg's voice turned bitter. "We had one centrifuge. They had entire cities doing this work." He was right. The Americans had built Oak Ridge and Hanford, industrial complexes so vast they consumed as much power as some nations. Factories, engineers, soldiers, scientists, more than 130,000 people, all focused on a single mission: build the bomb before Germany could. The German team at Farm Hall listened in stunned silence. They had imagined themselves as the elite of modern science, working on a divine secret. Now they realized they'd been outmatched, not in intellect, but in logistics. One of them muttered, "We worked in cellars and sheds. They worked in kingdoms of steel." For a long time, no one spoke. The silence wasn't embarrassment, it was recognition. Heisenberg finally looked up. This was never just a scientific race. It was an industrial one, a human one. They had what we never did: stability, resources, and cooperation. Otto Hahn, still pale and distant, nodded weakly. "And we had fear. Always fear." The others knew what he meant. In Nazi Germany, every conversation was monitored, every experiment questioned, every scientist afraid of making the wrong impression. They'd lived under suspicion, censorship, and the constant threat of execution. How could creativity thrive in terror? How could discovery happen when curiosity was dangerous? Farm Hall's microphones captured their realization. Germany's failure wasn't because they lacked genius, it was because they lacked freedom. And in that truth, Heisenberg's furious scribbling stopped. For the first time, he looked defeated. "America had the better laboratories," he whispered. "But we had the better reason not to succeed." That afternoon, the scientists gathered again in the main lounge. The air was thick, not with anger now, but with something heavier: comprehension. In the corner sat three German generals who had been listening in silence since the news broke. They were older men, hardened by war, decorated but disillusioned. General Erich von Stein, calm and composed, finally stood. "Gentlemen," he began, "you are missing the greater picture." His voice was low, but it commanded the room instantly. "This bomb, it doesn't just destroy cities. It destroys the very idea of war." The scientists turned toward him, confused. Von Stein continued, "Think about it. With this weapon, you don't fight battles. You don't invade. You threaten. Whoever possesses it holds the world in fear." He paused, his words sinking in. "This isn't a victory for physics. It's a victory for power. America now controls not just the battlefield, but the future." The men went quiet. They hadn't seen it that way. For them, the atomic bomb had been a problem of equations and energy. For von Stein, it was the end of an era, the final nail in the coffin of the old world. "Wars like ours," he said, "will never happen again. The next war will be fought in boardrooms and laboratories, not trenches." He looked around the room at the men who had once believed they were shaping the destiny of the Reich. "Gentlemen, Germany could never have won this. Even if you had built your bomb, we lacked what mattered most: the strength to sustain it, the unity to protect it, and the humanity to use it wisely." The statement left the room heavy with silence. One scientist whispered, "Then the war was lost before it began." Von Stein nodded. "Yes, and we were too proud to see it." The microphones hidden in the walls captured every word. To the British intelligence officers listening nearby, it was astonishing. Not just a confession of defeat, but an acknowledgement that the atomic bomb had changed civilization itself. In one night, the men of Farm Hall had gone from prisoners of war to unwilling philosophers of a new atomic age. Days passed at Farm Hall, but the topic never faded. The bomb haunted them, not just what it had done, but what it meant. Heisenberg spent hours pacing, replaying every decision of Germany's nuclear project. He remembered the bureaucrats, the shortages, the endless interference from Nazi officials who neither understood nor cared about the science. "We had no Manhattan Project," he said bitterly. "We had chaos." Kurt Diebner, one of the engineers, nodded. "They had 130,000 people. We had maybe 100. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker added, "And half of ours were terrified of being executed for saying the wrong thing." The truth was brutal. The Nazi regime had built a culture of fear that crushed innovation. Even as they poured resources into rockets, tanks, and secret weapons, they never grasped the scale of what nuclear energy could be. Heisenberg stared out the window. "Do you know what this means?" he said softly. "It wasn't the Allies' intelligence that beat us. It was their freedom." Otto Hahn spoke for the first time that day. "And our arrogance," he added quietly. "We thought intellect alone could win a war." The others nodded. They had been blinded not just by ideology, but by the illusion of superiority. They had underestimated democracy, assuming it was soft, indecisive, slow. Now they saw the truth. Democracy had built the bomb. Dictatorship had built its own destruction. It was a paradox that would haunt them for years. That evening, von Stein summed it up in a single sentence. "America built its weapon with cooperation. We built ours with fear. The results speak for themselves." And in that, everyone knew, the war had been decided long before Hiroshima ever burned. As the weeks went on, talk turned to one name: Hitler. The man who had ruled their world, demanded miracles, and dismissed anything he didn't understand. Heisenberg recalled the moment he'd tried to explain nuclear fission to the Führer in 1942. He'd spoken carefully, describing the theoretical power of atomic energy, that it could produce a chain reaction powerful enough to destroy entire cities. Hitler had stared blankly, uninterested. "How long would it take?" he asked. "At least 3 years," Heisenberg replied. Hitler waved a hand dismissively. "Too long. I need weapons now." That was it. The door closed on Germany's nuclear ambitions with a single gesture. Instead, Hitler demanded rockets, jets, supertanks, things that looked powerful, things that could be shown to the world. He liked visible strength, not invisible science. He called nuclear physics Jewish science, mocking it as a waste of time. And with those words, he sealed his own defeat. Because Germany's greatest scientists, many of them Jewish, had already fled. Einstein, Bohr, Fermi, Szilard, driven out, exiled, or silenced. And where did they go? To America. The irony was devastating. The very people Hitler wanted dead were the ones who gave his enemies the weapon that ended the war. Heisenberg's voice broke as he said it aloud. He destroyed his own victory through hatred. Von Stein added quietly, he destroyed his nation through arrogance. They all fell silent. Through the hidden microphones, the British listeners could hear only the creak of chairs, the shuffling of papers, and the occasional sigh. It was the sound of realization, the sound of men confronting the fact that their leaders' prejudice had undone everything they'd built. In that moment, they weren't just prisoners of war, they were witnesses to the consequences of blind ideology. And in the quiet halls of Farm Hall, the truth echoed louder than any explosion. Germany didn't lose to America's bomb. It lost to its own ignorance. The weeks at Farm Hall revealed a painful truth. Germany had never understood the scale of what was needed. Heisenberg, once confident, now went over every calculation again. He knew the science, but he hadn't fully comprehended the logistics. The Americans didn't just solve a physics problem, he said quietly to the others. They solved an industrial one. He pointed to a chalkboard, scrawling numbers that made the others recoil. To produce a single critical mass of uranium-235, you need more electricity than entire German cities can generate. You need hundreds of tons of raw uranium, enormous machinery, and thousands of workers. That's the only way it works. They had tried to separate uranium through small, inefficient methods, spinning a few centrifuges, building a few small reactors. America had built entire complexes, Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, cities dedicated entirely to making one weapon. Otto Hahn shook his head. And we thought we could compete. Heisenberg continued, this isn't a contest of genius. It's a contest of manpower, resources, and stability. The Americans had all three. We had none. The room fell silent. For the first time, they fully realized the gap between the two nations. Paul Hartek finally spoke. We weren't behind because we lacked talent. We were behind because we lacked structure. We had chaos. They had organization. And then came the budget. The numbers shocked even the stoic scientists. Germany had spent roughly $50 million on nuclear research. The United States had spent $2 billion, 40 times more. Do you see now? Heisenberg asked. We were already doomed before the first bomb was dropped. The generals listened silently. They had understood it intuitively, but now the evidence was undeniable. Von Stein leaned forward. It wasn't just science that failed Germany. It was leadership. It was politics. It was Hitler. The room sat heavy with acknowledgement. Their genius had been rendered irrelevant by the machinery of war, the corruption of ideology, and the negligence of the highest authority. By the end of the week, the scientists had gone from disbelief to bitter comprehension. They weren't just defeated, they were humiliated by the stark contrast between ambition and reality. The Manhattan Project hadn't just created a bomb, it had revealed the limitations of a dictatorship, the consequences of oppression, and the price of prejudice. As the days at Farm Hall stretched on, the conversation turned inward. They had spent decades in laboratories, solving equations and designing theoretical experiments. Now, with Hiroshima fresh in their minds, they confronted the human cost. Otto Hahn, usually quiet, could no longer remain silent. We discovered fission, he said, voice trembling, and now it's killed more people than I could have imagined. My discovery, my life's work, has become a weapon of mass destruction. Heisenberg looked down, silent. Even the generals, men hardened by war, seemed unsettled. What kind of monsters have we created? Muttered Kurt Diebner. The British microphones recorded the profound despair. Some scientists wrestled with guilt. Others were quietly relieved, relief that Hitler's regime had never managed to build a bomb themselves. Von Weizsäcker broke the silence. It's more than guilt. It's the realization of our own impotence. We were brilliant, yet powerless. Hartek spoke, his voice low but firm. We must accept the truth. The Americans were simply better, and not just better scientists, better planners, better organizers, better citizens. The moral weight of the conversation pressed down on everyone. These men had once believed their intellect could change the world. Now they understood that intelligence alone is not enough. It requires vision, resources, cooperation, and ethical leadership. Without it, genius becomes irrelevant. They argued, debated, and reflected. They confronted the reality that the Holocaust, the war, and the atomic bomb were not isolated events, but symptoms of a regime that had destroyed its own moral and intellectual foundation. For the first time, they admitted something they had never spoken aloud. Had Hitler supported them properly, had he valued the work of scientists over ideology, the course of the war could have been very different. But those were lost opportunities, mistakes born of arrogance, hatred, and paranoia. And with every passing day, the men at Farm Hall came closer to understanding the full moral cost of their obedience, their complicity, and their failures. The atmosphere at Farm Hall grew heavy as more time passed. The scientists, once proud and confident, now seemed diminished. Their conversations were quieter, reflective, often punctuated by long pauses. Even Heisenberg, who had once carried himself with authority, spoke less, scribbling numbers that no longer gave him clarity, only a sense of futility. The generals, too, noticed the psychological toll. Von Stein observed, "It's not the bombs that kill men. It's the truth, the weight of being outmatched, outplanned, and outsmarted by a democracy that had once seemed naive was crushing." Heisenberg admitted privately, "We were safe behind the Atlantic Ocean. We were insulated from direct attack, yet we still failed. The Americans had risked everything and outmaneuvered us completely." This recognition of their limitations, the combination of fear, oppression, and industrial inferiority, was devastating. Paul Hartek summarized it plainly. "We are witnessing not just the defeat of a nation, but the collapse of an entire world of thought we believed to be invincible." For the first time, the full psychological impact of the atomic bomb was clear to them. It was not merely a technical achievement, it was a demonstration of supremacy in science, industry, and strategy, all under the umbrella of a system that fostered innovation rather than crushed it. They began to reflect on their own choices, their complicity, and their inability to act independently under the Nazi regime. Every conversation returned to the same painful point. Germany hadn't lost because of a single weapon. It had lost because of an entire system that failed to protect, nurture, and trust its own intellectual elite. As the scientists struggled with the technical and moral consequences, the generals turned the conversation toward politics. Von Stein reminded them, "Even if you had built the bomb, Germany lacked the stability to use it. Our nation was surrounded, exhausted, and crumbling." He emphasized America's advantages: a population nearly double Germany's, oceans for defense, limitless natural resources, and a robust industrial base. The Manhattan Project wasn't just science, he said. It was a national effort, a democracy marshalling every resource, human and material, toward a single goal. The contrast was stark. Germany had brilliant scientists, yes, but they had no industrial might, no political stability, and no freedom to innovate. They had fear, distrust, and an ideology that alienated its best minds. The general's words resonated. Hitler's impatience, his hatred, and his paranoia had doomed every long-term project, including the nuclear program. The Americans had time. Germany had none. America had vision. Germany had delusion. America had inclusion. Germany had exclusion. The scientists began to understand that the war's outcome was not determined in battles alone, but in the foundations of society itself. It was a revelation that left them humbled, almost ashamed. Even as the technical and political truths became clear, the conversation inevitably turned to Hitler himself. Heisenberg recounted his meeting with the Führer in 1942. He had attempted to explain the potential of nuclear weapons. Hitler had dismissed the science as irrelevant. "How long will it take?" he asked. "At least 3 years," Heisenberg replied. "Too long," Hitler said. "I need weapons now." Instead, he pursued visible power, rockets, jets, supertanks, things he could see and understand. The irony was devastating. The very minds Hitler distrusted, Jewish scientists, brilliant theorists, were now creating the bomb for America. Von Stein summarized, he destroyed Germany's chances through ideology and hatred. The scientists realized that Hitler's personal blindness had sealed the fate of their nation. It wasn't miscalculation or lack of genius, it was his arrogance, impatience, and racism. Even if Germany had successfully built the bomb, it likely could not have used it in time. By the time production finished, the country itself would have been gone. By the end of their captivity, the men of Farm Hall understood a truth that went far beyond science. Germany had lost not because of battles, tanks, or strategy alone. It had lost because it had failed as a society, oppressive, fearful, fractured, and intolerant. The British microphones captured their final conversation. "What happens now?" one scientist asked. Von Stein answered quietly, "Now we live in America's world, and we can only pray they use this power wisely." Silence followed, not just from shock, but from comprehension. For the first time, they understood the lessons of Hiroshima, the consequences of leadership, and the cost of ideology. They had been defeated before the first bomb fell, defeated by fear, by arrogance, by tyranny, and by history itself. And in that silent estate in England, the world's first atomic prisoners revealed the truth. Germany had never stood a chance. The war had been lost long before the first blast, not because of technology alone, but because of human failings. The story of Farm Hall would remain hidden for decades, yet it offers a lesson that echoes still. Genius is meaningless without freedom. Power is hollow without foresight, and hatred destroys more than any bomb ever could. Weeks turned into months at Farm Hall. The men were no longer just prisoners, they were witnesses to history, watching the consequences of their world's actions unfold. The news from Japan arrived daily, reports of Hiroshima's devastation followed by the destruction of Nagasaki. Photographs, radio broadcasts, and news articles painted a picture of annihilation. Inside the manor, the scientists and generals lived with a different kind of reality. The weight of knowing, every calculation, every formula, every failed experiment suddenly carried a human cost they could not ignore. Otto Hahn often sat alone in the garden, staring at the horizon. "We created a chain reaction we never intended to use," he said quietly. "And now it's killed hundreds of thousands." Heisenberg, meanwhile, obsessed over the technical details. He calculated yield, energy release, and destructive radius for hours at a time. But the numbers no longer exhilarated him. They haunted him. Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker turned philosophical. "We always believed in progress," he murmured, "in knowledge for the sake of knowledge. But knowledge without wisdom is catastrophic." Even the generals reflected on the consequences. General von Stein, a man trained for strategy and command, admitted that no war plan could have prepared him for this. "We understood tactics," he said, "but we didn't understand morality on this scale." The conversations became somber, almost ritualistic. They measured each word, careful not to evade responsibility. And yet they also realized something profound. They were privileged to understand a moment that the world was only beginning to grasp. Farm Hall's hidden microphones continued recording. British intelligence would later note the combination of intellectual brilliance and moral despair. A rare, almost unprecedented insight into the human side of science in wartime. The men came to a consensus, quiet but unspoken. Knowledge is power, but power without foresight is devastation. And for the first time, they all understood the weight of their own decisions, the weight of inaction and the weight of ideology. As the shock of the bombs faded, a deeper conversation emerged, one that weighed ethics against ambition, morality against obedience. Heisenberg spoke at length about the duality of science. "Every experiment," he said, "carries a moral dimension. The same knowledge that can create life can also destroy it." Otto Hahn agreed. "I discovered nuclear fission, not a bomb. And yet, my discovery was weaponized. We are not blameless, but neither are we entirely guilty." The generals pushed the discussion further. Von Stein emphasized the broader responsibility of leadership. The bomb did not just kill people, it reshaped global politics. Whoever controls this technology dictates morality through fear. The scientists wrestled with a terrifying realization. Their intelligence had been applied to an ideology that made morality irrelevant, and their inaction, their submission, their obedience had contributed to the global imbalance they now observed. Hartek spoke bluntly. We have lived in a bubble, thinking our work was abstract, disconnected from consequences. Now we know that science divorced from ethics is dangerous. For hours the group debated, often shouting, often silent. They discussed questions with no answers. Could nuclear weapons ever be morally justified? Was any nation capable of using such power wisely? These conversations revealed fractures within the group. Some admitted relief that Germany had failed. Others expressed shame that their brilliance had been used for a regime built on hate. By the end of the day, they understood one thing. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon, it was a moral mirror, reflecting human ambition, fear, and folly. And the reflection was grim. News from the outside world became a constant presence in Farm Hall. Reports of Japan's surrender, the end of World War II in the Pacific, and the beginning of post-war negotiations in Europe reached them daily. The generals discussed the geopolitical consequences. Von Stein noted, this weapon has altered the balance of power forever. Nations that embrace it gain supremacy without fighting traditional wars. Those that do not are vulnerable. The scientists understood the implications as well. We were part of a turning point, Heisenberg said, not just in warfare, but in history itself. They discussed the rise of the United States as a superpower. Its industrial capacity, democratic governance, and scientific innovation were now unassailable. Germany, in contrast, had been crippled by dictatorship, ideology, and fear. Von Weizsäcker reflected on the post-war world. This is no longer a Europe dominated by empires. The world has changed. Nuclear capability has rewritten diplomacy, deterrence, and power dynamics. The men began to see themselves not as losers of a war, but as witnesses to a new world order. Their failure was personal and national, but it was also historical. The conversations often returned to one central question. Could any nation use such power responsibly? And if so, what would prevent the same mistakes from recurring? The realization was sobering. The atomic bomb had created a permanent shadow over humanity, one that would never fade. Even as they wrestled with ethics and geopolitics, the personal cost became undeniable. Hahn, Weizsäcker, and Diebner all spoke of the internal conflict, the tension between pride in scientific achievement and horror at its consequences. We were the best in Europe, Hahn admitted, and yet our brilliance has been rendered irrelevant, overshadowed by decisions we could not control. The generals, too, reflected on personal responsibility. Von Stein spoke quietly of the soldiers and civilians whose fates had been sealed by choices made far above them. We can plan battles, he said. We can strategize, but we cannot rewrite history. The scientists also confronted guilt. Had they done enough? Could they have warned the world earlier? Could their work have been redirected toward energy rather than destruction? Hartek admitted, we followed orders, we obeyed. But obedience does not absolve us from consequences. The months in Farm Hall became a crucible of thought, forcing each man to reconcile personal ambition, professional duty, and moral responsibility. By the end of Chapter 16, they had achieved clarity. Their failure was systemic, but their insight now carried weight. They could bear witness to history, even if they could not undo it. The final chapter of their captivity focused on lessons learned, for themselves and for the world. The scientists and generals agreed on several truths. Knowledge is double-edged. Scientific discovery brings both progress and potential catastrophe. Freedom fuels innovation. The Americans succeeded because they encouraged open inquiry and collaboration, not because they had superior intelligence alone. Leadership matters. Hitler's arrogance, prejudice, and impatience destroyed Germany's greatest potential. Ethics cannot be ignored. Science divorced from moral guidance can become a weapon of mass destruction. Scale and vision determine victory. Talent alone cannot win wars. Infrastructure, manpower, and resources are essential. Von Stein summed it up. We witnessed history. We failed, but in failure we also understand the world differently. Knowledge without wisdom is dangerous. Power without morality is catastrophic. Heisenberg, with a quiet voice, added, "Farm Hall has shown us that our genius was never enough. And perhaps, in recognizing that, we can prevent future tragedies." The hidden microphones recorded their final words, a testament to the most brilliant minds of Germany confronting their limits. They left Farm Hall not as victors, but as chroniclers of a turning point in human history. The dawn of the atomic age, the consequences of ideology, and the fragile balance between genius and morality. And as the doors of Farm Hall finally opened, they stepped into a world forever changed, one where the lessons of their failure would echo across generations, warning humanity of the power of knowledge, the cost of arrogance, and the responsibility each generation bears for the world it creates.